So, hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar on emerging technologies and novel design in assistive and rehabilitation technologies. We are recording the meeting today and it will be available on YouTube afterwards. So if you miss anything or you want to refer to anything later, it will be available sometime by the end of this week. I'm joined by Philip Davenport and Claire Piddington today, who will be giving their talks. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you'd like to in the chat facilities, direct any questions to the host IPEM and I'll receive them and then I'll share the questions at the end with the speakers, if that's okay. This just prevents any distractions during the talk. And anything else, any questions or any issues, just pop to me in the chat and I'll be able to assist throughout the talk. So thank you very much and I'll hand over to Claire now. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm Claire Piddington and I work at Salisbury District Hospital as a trainee clinical scientist. I'm just going to be talking through using 3D printing for custom-made aids to daily living, and I'll go through a case study where I made a device to assist one of our clients with plugging in his wheelchair charger. Okay, so to start with, just a bit of background on the need for custom-made aids to daily living. Activities of daily living, as I'm sure most of you know, are those basic things that we do every day, such as dressing, eating, cooking, and cleaning. So there's the really basic things that you need to live: dressing, toileting, eating, and there's the more instrumented things such as cooking and cleaning. And it's these things that often require specific aids. They're really key to independence and they've been used for a long time as a measure of independence. And by using aids, we can prolong someone's independence with their aids, their tasks of daily living. There's a ton of commercial devices, like more than could be counted, and there's a lot that do pretty much the same thing, but in slightly different ways. So you can do a lot of work in trying to find the right one for your client, but sometimes it's just not gonna happen. Sometimes needs are so specific that we need to go for something custom made. And also sometimes our tasks are specific. My day doesn't include plugging in a wheelchair, but somebody else's might. So that's when we can look to 3D printing as a great resource. It's used in medical field for a long time now, and the pros of rapid development and making multiple prototypes, testing and refining them can really help in making sure that you get the best solution at the end. Where this is really useful in custom made aids to daily living is that you can get the user really involved. So you can give them the prototypes, you can show them the CAD models. That's really useful for them to see what's going on before you even start printing. And yeah, you can get a really good user involvement. You also have a lot of freedom of design that you wouldn't get in traditional manufacturing methods. So really small, complex geometries, and it's very low cost once you have everything in place and depending on your materials. It's also low waste. Again, that high precision is really important. And just a few examples here. So I'm not sure if we can see my mouse, but the man with the crutch, that's been scanned and molded. So he grasped a like plasticine clay sort of thing, and that's been scanned exactly for him. So then we can have really like custom to the person and also custom to the task. So we also have the inhaler, which isn't going to be everybody's task day to day, but it will be for quite a few people. And then this is the client who I'll be talking to. So here's our client. He was a man in his mid-40s. He lives in a 2-story house with his wife and small daughter. I think she was about 3 or 4. And he is a bilateral amputee and he uses a powered wheelchair. On top of being a bilateral amputee, he also has multiple digital amputations. And at the time when I first met him, only his right thumb was fully intact and functional. Some of his digits have reasonable length on them, but unfortunately the skin on them is so delicate and vulnerable that he can't really use them for anything else. It's also quite painful for him. So his grip is mainly between his palm, so he can grip kind of like this, or between his thumb and his, like, that first knuckle there. So sort of that kind of grip. So you can get a bit of a pinch grip, but not very well. And he has been using a Invocash Mirage with a Shark system controls and an Invocash charger. So our challenge and the problem that he was having, that he needed a little bit of help with, was connecting and disconnecting this charger. You can kind of see in the picture, it's a circular XLR connector with 3 pins. The problem with this is that it's really easy to connect in a little bit of the way, but it's very difficult to make sure that you have it the right way when you're pushing it, like to connect it fully. He can't see where he's plugging into. As you can see, it's like behind the charging, the control panel. So it's out of sight. So you can't visually line it up and get it right. And you can't orientate it once it's in there. He can't turn it very easily. And even gripping it, he finds hard. When we met him, he had already been through 2 of these chargers because he was basically having to just pull on the cable, and that eventually would expose the wires underneath and get it loosening. So it was getting to the point of being dangerous. It might not seem like such a big deal, but this is something that really affected his independence, because it meant that he couldn't just plug it in as and when he needed to. He needed to get help from his wife, and as I said, he has a young daughter, so she was busy with her at times as well. Okay, so I'll go through the design process and how 3D printing was key in that. So for the initial concepts, we thought about the kind of ways that we could fix this problem, and we involved him all the way through. So we went to talk to him and discuss these 3 main concepts, and decided with him the one that we thought was most suitable. So we had a few. The first was a fly lead, basically to bring that socket into the line of sight. Unfortunately, the model of wheelchair that he has didn't have that option. He could have upgraded to another one, but this wasn't functional in his house. It would be too large for his hallways and doorways. So that wasn't really an option. We could have modified his charger electronically, but we didn't really want to go messing around with that. It would be well out of manufacturer's intended use, and we wouldn't have the testing facilities in-house to make sure that it was safe afterwards. So the next thing was to replace this collar here, which is the black bit that unscrews from the plug, and replace that with a handle. But unfortunately, due to the dimensions, in order to do that, in order to get it off, you'd have to rewire it. And again, we wouldn't have the capability in-house to do that or to test it to make sure it's safe afterwards. So the idea that we went with after discussion with him was to attach it over this collar. We really didn't want to be attaching anything to the cable, as that would be the same problem that he was already having. And we couldn't really attach it to the case because that goes all the way into where it plugs in. So anything attached onto there would be very much in the way and it wouldn't be able to connect properly. And if it's attached to the collar, we can replace it and easy. We can put it on quite easily. But the collar is quite complex. If to look at it, it's non-standard. The ridges are all it's quite rubbery material. It's quite flexible. So yeah, it was going to be difficult to make sure that it was secure, but it's kind of the only option we had at this point. So there we go. That's what we went for. And then, so because of that complex geometry on that collar, we thought that 3D printing would be the best way to go, as it offers us those the precision, the small, and the complex geometries. So I came up with multiple design ideas, which I produced in CAD. Didn't take too long. It was quite simple, and I shared these with our client, who at that point we discussed what each one was and how it would work, and from talking to him, he chose the one that he wanted. He found these really useful because they were like a visual representation of what was going to happen. It wasn't just a sketch, it was a 3D model. And then we went through a whole iterative design process. So these all look very similar in the picture. The white part is the 3D printed part, but they're quite different. We just really had to refine the tolerances and the geometry of it, just really small adjustments to try and make sure that it fit properly. And then from that, we could go to more like other features like beveling all those corners, making sure that it was really safe. But we wanted to make sure first that it attached properly. And we took a prototype to him and it worked really well. He was very happy with it. And we made the final design based on that with some minor adjustments. The main one being this O-ring here in the second picture on the top. That just helps to secure it more onto that collar part. And it was very successful. He used it for quite a long period, and he found it much easier to plug it and unplug it. But unfortunately, his needs changed. He had his thumb amputated as well. Nothing to do with the device as far as I'm aware, but just a progression of his condition. And he could no longer hold it because it was very much designed for him to put his thumb in the hole. And if he didn't have that thumb, he couldn't do it. And because of that, he'd also had some problem with it sliding down the cable. It became loose because he'd been pushing it and pulling it to get it out. So we altered the design a bit, but because we had a lot of the dimensions already on file from the previous CAD models, this was a lot easier. It's quite a big change in the way it works, but it was actually very simple to do because we already had those. We knew what worked, we knew what fitted where. And yeah, I think it's been given to him now, and I think he's getting on quite well with it. So, and this is just to discuss how 3D printing was really key in this process. We've proven that it's useful. We wouldn't have been able to achieve those sort of geometries without traditional manufacturing methods that we use in-house. And because his needs are so complex, like it's digital amputations, you're not going to see those hands ever again. Nobody else is going to have hands exactly like his, and very few people are going to have his problem. So it had to be custom just for him. And the fact that it had to interact with other equipment was a really big one. So not only is everyone's needs completely different, but their existing solutions will be completely different. If you had a different wheelchair, it might have been easier in a different or more difficult. So if we're making something to interact with something else, the custom route is really useful. And the 3D printing gave us that design flexibility, precision, speed, and affordability. I think the part in the end cost £1.20, which is pretty good. Obviously, that doesn't include time and expertise, but overall, I think our minimum price is £30, and that's pretty good, considering aids that you can buy online can be really expensive. And yeah, it was just really nice and client focused, and we got to have a lot of interaction with him to make sure that we got the best decision, and we could refine that design over and over. I think in total I printed about 5 or 6 of those to get it right. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Claire.
Cheers.
So we will now pass over to Philip, if you would like to share your screen.
Davenport, and I'm a higher medical device specialist with the MHRA and have been for the last 3 years. But my original training was as a clinical scientist in Birmingham, doing assistive technology, gait analysis, and that sort of thing. So today I'm going to talk about some of the changes that are coming in with the medical device regulations. Obviously, the crossover time for that is coming up quickly. So some of the aspects of that which will impact assistive technology the most. So yeah, as I said, I'll cover the role of the MHRA medical device regulation in this country, some of the changes that are coming in with the new regulations this May, and some of those most likely to affect in assistive technology. So those regulation changes, the health institution exemption, custom devices, and a quick summary of some of the others. And before I start, just a quick disclaimer that this represents my interpretation and based on the information currently available, and you should always seek advice of professional advisors. So the Medicine and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency actually has 3 centres within it. The MHRA, which looks at regulation, CPRD, that's the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, who summarise data from GP practices for sort of larger scale studies, and NIBSC, which is the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, who do a lot of work with vaccines and that sort of thing. And I work within MHRA Devices, which is a subset of the MHRA on the right-hand side. When we talk about medical devices, the MHRA is the UK competent authority for medical devices. So we accredit notified bodies that are based in this country. We register manufacturers who place their products on the market and are based in the UK. And we work with patients, healthcare professionals, members of the public to raise awareness of any safety issues that are out there. So a quick slide on why we're changing the regulations at this time. So the previous set of regulations were based on the Medical Device Directive, which was first written in 1993. And obviously you can appreciate that technology has changed quite a bit since then. Things like software and is now much more common. There have been technological advances all across the industry. There are devices that just didn't exist at that time that are now require regulation, and it's also in response to some changes in that environment. So although we have a map of the European Union on the bottom right that is a little out of date these days, that expansion and that change in makeup of the bodies that use the medical device regulations has meant some changes. On the top, we've also got issues that became apparent. So that's a metal-on-metal hip implant, which was had quite a widespread set of issues with metal ions being distributed in the bloodstream, which has meant that some devices are now classified as higher risk than they were previously. On the bottom left, we've got a PIP breast implant from France, and the issues surrounding that and the oversight of their notified body means that changes to how that process is carried out were also necessary. So what's happened is the Medical Device Directive and the Active Implantables Medical Device Directive have been combined into the new medical device regulations, and the In Vitro Diagnostic Directive has been converted into the In Vitro Diagnostic Medical Device Regulations. And the difference between a directive and a regulation is that the regulation gets transposed directly into UK law when it was agreed, whereas the directives were implemented separately via a different legal instrument, and that was one of the other differences that led to slight inconsistencies between member states in Europe. So this slide is a little busy, but it does have a description of a lot of the key changes, and you can see it's quite extensive. So a whole range of stuff from how notified bodies work to the obligations of manufacturers and lots of things. But if you dig into this a bit deeper, actually the changes that impact class 1 devices, which is the majority of assistive technology, whether that's seating or prostheses or orthotics or whatever, actually those are much more limited. So I've highlighted a couple of those changes. One is that, as I've said before, things like the health institution exemption, requirements for clinical evidence, and that sort of thing, those will affect class 1 manufacturers and people using these devices, but actually most of those changes really only apply to those classified as higher risk. So really the changes shouldn't be so dramatic for those manufacturing class 1 products. So to go into the health institution exemption, previously this was actually part of the UK regulations, but is now written into the text of the medical device regulations. So it will be consistent across Europe. And the idea behind this is that health institutions that make medical devices are exempt from some of the requirements of those regulations, but that is under a tighter, more restricted definition than previously. So to go through that list in a bit more detail, products, as always, have to meet the general safety and performance requirements, which is the new name for essential requirements in the MDD. So they still have to perform in the same and be designed in the same way as commercial products. Hospitals and healthcare institutions designing devices will have to have an appropriate quality management system in place. Now, for medical device manufacturers, the corresponding standard is ISO 13485. And although the text of the MDR doesn't make a requirement on exactly how you go about that, I think the expectation is really that if there's an appropriate standard, then really manufacturers of any sort should be meeting it. The next one is very key. The activity has to be justified. That is, the design of the medical device has to be being carried out by a health institution under this exemption for a good reason. Whether that's products on the market don't exist or that they don't meet the particular clinical need of particular patient groups, then that is reason to manufacture your own. What it can't be is just based on cost. So it can't be that you can manufacture something cheaper than something that's on the market. It has to be addressing some need that isn't otherwise met. You need to maintain technical documentation as you would with any other device, but there are differences in how that's stored and used compared to other products. There needs to be a publicly available declaration that a particular health institution is manufacturing devices under the exemption, and that needs to be placed on, the assumption is that will be on the organisation's website. And there are still obligations regarding reviewing the clinical use of the device once it's been placed into use, and any corrective actions that you take on devices that are out there. This table has a summary of those requirements. This is actually taken from the draft MHRA guidance on the health institution exemption, which I would encourage anyone to have a good read through if that's the kind of activity that you're involved in. I'll come back to this in a second when we contrast it to the custom devices requirements. So for custom devices, these are ones that are intended for use by a specific individual patient. And for devices like that, there are specific exemptions from aspects of the regulations. But in general, the manufacturer of that product, whoever they are, still has to meet many of those same requirements. So they still need to meet those general safety and performance requirements. There's that same requirements for clinical evaluation, including in post-market phase. There are requirements for vigilance. They will need to have, like any other manufacturer, someone responsible for regulatory compliance within that organisation. But there are still differences to regular manufacturing. And again, that table again, which I'll edit now to show where those differences exist between the health institution exemption and custom medical devices. So custom medical devices are those that are placed on the market, whereas health institution exemption only applies to those that are only placed into service. And what that effectively means is that health institutions need to remain in control of the devices that they're using. They need to stay within the same organisation, whereas a custom device can go out into the world. Custom medical devices require that written prescription from a healthcare professional, but that isn't necessarily required for a device manufactured under the health institution exemption. There's a slight difference in that only the health institution exemption needs to have that justification for why you're going down that route, whereas that isn't required for custom devices. And neither should be on an industrial scale or a mass-produced scale. As I said just a moment ago, the health institution exemption can apply to an individual patient or a group of patients, whereas custom devices are specifically intended for the use by one individual. There's less requirements further down, so under the health institution exemption, so you don't need that person responsible for regulatory compliance. You have that publicly available declaration rather than statement of compliance. You wouldn't need notified body input, for instance, and you only need to review post-market experience internally rather than the full vigilance reporting that's required for custom devices. And also changes in periodic safety update reports, which are an additional requirement for custom devices. To touch on some of the other changes that are there as well, as I mentioned earlier, there are some classification changes. So some devices are now further up those risk categories and need additional oversight. There are some textual changes to those general safety and performance requirements compared to essential requirements. So it is worth reviewing that. I've put in unique device identifiers as well, because for devices going onto the market that aren't custom, those will be necessary. I've touched on briefly additional requirements for clinical evidence, and that is something that's really throughout the new MDR, is that clinical evidence is much more to the forefront, and it really does need to be integrated with post-market review and that declaration of conformity as well. There are changes to aspects of the supply chain as well that are regulated now under the MDR for the first time. So importers and distributors have to check that the devices they receive and pass on meet the requirements, checking that they have a CE mark and all that sort of thing. And for hospitals that are implanting devices, they also need to supply information to patients about those devices that are being implanted. I've added a quick slide on some useful things to go and read up afterwards. So there is MHRA guidance on the medical device regulations, and I mentioned that guidance on the health institution exemption specifically. We're officially in the transition period after Brexit now, so that MHRA Brexit guidance has been revamped to deal with that. This next one, the MDCG has issued guidance for Class 1 medical device manufacturers through the European Commission, and that's some really good advice that really does summarise every step of the conformity process. And if there are any questions, then you can either email this link here, which gets you through to the MHRA questions centre, or you can email me directly as well. So to quickly summarise, there are substantial changes to how devices are regulated now, but for assistive technology and Class 1 manufacturers in particular, those changes are less significant than for those with higher risk classifications. Those manufacturing devices under the health institution exemption do face enhanced requirements for demonstrating that compliance. And it really is worth understanding what those requirements are and what you are expected to be doing for compliance. That decision whether to go by the route of the health institution exemption or if you're manufacturing custom devices is a strategic decision that needs to be taken by your organisation. You may be manufacturing some that come under one or the other, so you do need to review that. I mentioned those clinical evidence requirements. There's a lot of material out there on how that's changed, and also for post-market surveillance as well. And thanks very much. And I think we have questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So I'll now share my screen. We've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. Thank you. Sorry, it's there we go. That's not it. There we go. So there's a few questions here for you, Claire, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah. So the first one is on what the printer that we used and the specifications about that. So we're lucky enough that we share our office space and some of our equipment with Oddstock Medical, and they have a MakerBot Replicator 2. The device itself costs just under £1,800, and it uses, so we printed with PLA filament, which comes at 1.75 millimeters, and we can print at a precision of 0.1 millimeters. As I said in the presentation, the part itself cost about £1.20, and a spool of PLA, about £0.5 or 220 grams, costs about £22. And it took about 2 hours to print each piece, and the print volume of that particular model is about 30 by 15 by 15, so it's quite small, but you can, for custom aids, it's probably going to be quite small devices there. And then for the second one, I think that Philip has kind of covered more of this and is definitely more knowledgeable than I ever would be. Basically, it is custom made, and it is very much a class 1 device. I think most aids to daily living are going to come under class 1. So it's the simpler side of it, fortunately. You can do self-assessment, just so long as you are like complying with all the general requirements and safety. And yeah, there are some aids to daily living that aren't necessarily custom made, aren't necessarily medical devices, but because it's custom made specifically for a person's need, I think that pretty much classifies it as having to be a medical device then. So yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So on question 1 for mine, I've actually talked about that briefly. The actual regulation itself doesn't mention a specific quality standard. It just says that it has to be suitable. The expectation is that since a standard exists for quality management of medical device manufacturing, that people should be certainly working towards getting that and having that in place. But if you can demonstrate that something you have provides equivalent performance or equivalent protection, then that should be acceptable as well. In terms of the impact of Brexit and COVID-19 on the implementation of the MDR, the transition date is still set to be May this year. There is noises from various directions about whether that would be pushed back, but at the moment it is still set for that transition date. But if anything on that comes out, then I'm sure it'll be publicised quite widely. I didn't mention EC Corrigendum number 2 in my talk, but this was a change that was published due to the limited availability of notified bodies able to accredit under the medical device regulations. So this affects devices that are up-classified under the MDR compared to MDD, and that shouldn't really affect any assistive technology devices. That would affect things that are, for instance, reusable surgical equipment and that sort of thing. The effect is that they get extra time to get that notified body check in place effectively, so they have a few more years. But for the majority of Class 1 devices, because that notified body check isn't necessary, they will still need to comply by the implementation date. And last one, what happens if previous devices that complied with the previous regulations no longer comply with the updated ones? Do they have to comply with the new ones, or can they continue existing as they complied with previous regulations? So there isn't a grandfathering clause under the MDR. So any new products that go onto the market, anything that's sold from May 2020 that's a Class 1 device and doesn't come under any of the other deferments, will have to comply with the new regulations. Equipment that's already out there in use isn't affected. It's only for new products that are being sold effectively, which hopefully answers that. But yeah, if a device that you're making will no longer comply with the regulations, then you shouldn't be selling it after May 2020.
Thank you both very much for that. I'm just going to double check in the chat just in case we've had any further questions coming through. No, we've good. We've answered all the questions that have come through in the chat. So just like to say thank you to both. Thank you very much to you both. And this webinar will be, as I said earlier, recorded and available on YouTube later in the week. So thank you very much, and keep your eyes open for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.